Hey there kids, welcome back. David Eon here in the video game room, and today I wanted to have a quick discussion about MEGO. MEGO. Any MEGO fans out there? I sure hope so. I'm a MEGO fan. I'm a big MEGO fan, past and present. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. I love my MEGO figures. I used to have a really huge collection of MEGO figures back in the day, which I lost because of my ex. Long story. I like the new MEGO figures that are coming out now. And I feel like now, right now, is the time for MEGO. Not 40 years ago. Right now is the time for MEGO. And I'm going to tell you why that is. Let me just show you this again really quick here. I don't know if you noticed the price tag on this Richie Cunningham, $5.99. So, and this came out in I think 1976. So 43 years ago, $6, $5-6 for a MEGO figure. So technically, the modern MEGO figures, Action Jackson, are about 2/3 more expensive. So relatively cheap by comparisons, pretty much affordable to adult collectors. One of the few affordable action figures out there. I'm going to emphasize again, I'm a big fan of MEGO, past and present, because I may say a few things you may not get at first, but stick with me. I'm not dissing MEGO. I'm just making a point, because now is the time for MEGO, not 40 years ago. 40 years ago, MEGO was in many respects kind of ahead of their time. They were doing some things that didn't make sense in the 70s and 80s, but it makes sense now. And those mistakes, if you want to call them that, in the 70s and 80s, is part of what kind of ran MEGO into the ground and forced them into bankruptcy. Now, keep in mind that most action figure toys, and action figure toys, really the birth of them, you could call the birth of action figures a Hasbro creation, because it really kind of started with G.I. Joe in 1964. So 1964 to 1994 is that pocket where action figures were just, really for kids and really imaginative. It's changed a lot because it's angled towards an adult collector market now. But most action figures that were being produced were fantasy adventure related, including MEGO. MEGO did it too. They did fantasy and adventure type stuff, Planet of the Apes, Star Trek, like I just showed my Uhura here, the one survivor of my original Star Trek collection. I used to have all of them on the card. So they did a lot of that fantasy and adventure stuff too, but they did a lot of other stuff, like Richie here. Richie Cunningham, who doesn't even really look like Richie, he actually looks like Quasimodo. But MEGO wasn't known for exact likenesses, quite frankly, back in the day. But like I was saying, as most action figure lines were fantasy adventure related, including MEGO, MEGO had another passion, like Richie there. And that passion is part of what ran MEGO into the ground. And that passion was characterizing pop culture icons or pop culture characters in action figure form. So while everyone else was doing strictly fantasy and adventure oriented action figures, literally everyone was doing something that was strictly action adventure, fantasy adventure oriented, even if it was based on a character, even if it was like the Lone Ranger or something from a movie or TV show, Star Wars, whatever. MEGO was doing figures of things that for that time period, for the 70s and the 80s, just did not make any sense. Like the Love Boat, as another example. Because I can promise you in the 1970s there weren't any 7-year-old kids that were watching the Love Boat and wishing they had a Love Boat playset and 3 3/4 inch action figures. It was not happening. But MEGO was doing it. MEGO was making those figures. MEGO was in the habit of producing action figures for things that no one was going to buy. Like Laverne and Shirley. As another example. At that time, there was no adult collector's market for action figures. There was an adult collector's market. They just weren't interested in action figures because that's not what they grew up with. And that's another topic of discussion. Actually, I'm going to do another video on that specific topic. Because the adult collector's market, it's always been there. It's just that right now it's about action figures and toys from the specifically 70s, 80s, and early 90s now. So many of the series that MEGO made figures for, kids didn't want, and there was no adult collector's market for action figures at that time. I mean, come on, kids didn't want a 12.5-inch James Bond Moonraker figure. This wasn't even a movie that the average child was going to be able to see. It didn't make any sense. But in many respects, like I was saying, you could argue that MEGO was kind of ahead of its time. Some of the lines that were being produced make sense now, but that's because in today's market, more adults are collecting action figures than children are. Children aren't interested in action figures so much anymore. Grown-ups are. When we do on our channel, my wife and I, when we do our toy hunt videos, we don't see kids in the action figure aisles. We see other adults. We see grown-ups looking at wrestling figures, looking at Funko Pops, looking at Star Wars figures. Not kids. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, MEGO was producing line after line of action figures that just ended up getting dumped in clearance. And after a while, retailers, they're not going to be bothered with buying products that they can't even break even on. Too much product going to clearance is the death of a toy line. It's at the beginning of the end for any toy series. Period. Think back about when you saw big clearances on specific toy lines. Masters of the Universe is one of the most classic of these. All their stuff bottomed out all at once. It was on clearance everywhere. And then suddenly, they just stopped selling them. Show was off the air. Masters was gone all the way until 200X. Just faded away. Same thing with Star Wars. They cranked Star Wars figures out for years after the Star Wars franchises had stopped, and they had the Power of the Force coin thing going. And then one day, tons of it was on clearance at KB toy stores. You never saw Star Wars figures again until the second trilogy. But now that there's an adult toy market for action figures, mostly based on nostalgia, MEGO makes perfect sense. See, Cheers action figures to an adult collector suddenly becomes kind of a cool idea. I can get a Norm action figure with a beer mug? Yeah, maybe I'll pick one of those up, right? But if they made Cheers action figures in the 80s, while Cheers was still on the air and there was no adult collector's market for action figures, nobody would have bought those. No, nobody would have bought those. It didn't make any sense. But now it makes sense. Because now you've got the adult collector's market. You've got, like I said, the adult collector's market for toys has always been there. It was just always kind of focused on something else. But now it's about pop culture icon items. It's about action figures. It's about play sets and toys, and people are looking back to their childhood and saying, I remember when I had this, I remember when I had that. But that feeds into a modern perspective as well, where you're like, it would be cool if they had made an action figure of this, this, and this, because now I'm interested in it. And MEGO is one of those companies that's making that happen. So it makes perfect sense now. And honestly, I hope that MEGO continues to do well. It seems like they're doing all right. They started off kind of rocky with Target, and Target's kind of a mess to work with. You couldn't find stuff. Target employees act like they don't know what you're talking about. If you ordered stuff off their website, a lot of people had a lot of trouble with it. It was damaged, but they were locked in with Target, and I've speculated that I think it had something to do with one of Target's programs that they have for producers, companies that manufacture a product that they'll invest in you if you sell exclusively at Target. And so I think that Marty Abrams and the new MEGO went through that little bit of an investment period with Target, and that's why it was sold exclusively through them until they got big enough that they could get away from that. And now MEGO product is popping up all over the place. I've seen it at Books A Million. It's supposed to be coming to Walmart. It's showing up in a lot of other places, which is a good deal because it'll make it easier to find some of these figures, although you're not going to get the best price point always. But that's my point. Anyways, it's like, it makes sense now, but looking back on it, you have to admit, very often MEGO made action figures of things that if you were a kid in the 70s would have left you scratching your head. Why did they make this? Who wants to buy this? Back in the 70s, it didn't make sense. Back in the 80s, it didn't make sense. But it makes sense now. So now's a great time for MEGO to make a comeback. What do you think about that? Tell me what your thoughts are about those points in the comments section down below. I'd love to see what you think and feel about that. Share your thoughts with us. Find me on Instagram, Open by Chance on Instagram. Check me out there. I do actually post photos there occasionally. Share the video if you can. I would sure appreciate it. Subscribe if you're new. Give it a thumbs up. Easiest way to show your appreciation. Check out some of the other content. I do a lot more than just discussions here. And always trying to reach out to the various toy collecting communities. I collect a lot of stuff. My wife does as well. Take a look, and I will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.